She stepped off that train alone. No family, no money, no way back. The last mail-order bride nobody else had chosen, about to marry a complete stranger in the middle of the wilderness. Most women would have turned around and run. But Adelaide Morrison walked forward anyway. And what happened next would change everything she ever believed about love, belonging, and what it truly means to find home. If you love stories of rugged Western hearts, unexpected love blooming on dusty frontier trails, the quiet strength of mothers, and the deep human bonds that hold us together through the hardest of times, you're exactly where you belong. This channel is your campfire, and every story we tell burns with the same truth, that love, in all its forms, is the most powerful force the West has ever seen. Sometimes being last chosen doesn't mean you were unwanted. It means you were being saved for exactly the right life. If Adelaide's courage moved something in your heart, don't let it stop here. Drop a below, share this story with someone who needs to believe in love again, and subscribe so you never miss the next soul that walks off the train into something beautiful.
The conductor had already walked by twice, his stare telling her plain as day that her time was up. At 22 years old, after traveling nearly 3,000 miles from Boston, a telegram had made it clear. She was the very last mail-order bride the Western Marriage Bureau had this season. Finally, Adelaide got to her feet, trying to smooth the wrinkles out of her navy traveling dress as she headed for the door. The September sun felt surprisingly warm on her face when she walked down the metal steps, her boots finding their footing on the wooden platform. It was 1876, and Downeyville was a town tucked into the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was a gold mining spot that had seen better days, but it was still hanging on with pure stubbornness. Pine trees stood like guards all around the town, and you could hear the Yuba River rushing somewhere nearby, a constant whisper that seemed to say nothing here was meant to last. She scanned the area looking for a face that might be looking for hers. The platform was empty now, except for a railroad man pushing a cart of bags and an older woman sweeping dust that would be back in an hour. Adelaide's heart just sank. Maybe it was all a mistake. Maybe the man who sent for a depicted bride had changed his mind or found a local girl, or just decided the whole idea was plain foolish. Miss Morrison. The voice that spoke from behind her was deep and a little unsure. Adelaide turned around and saw a man standing at the edge of the platform, holding his hat in his hands. He was tall, a good bit over 6 feet, with wide shoulders that told you he was no stranger to hard work. His hair was a dark brown, so dark it was almost black, and it touched his collar. The sun and wind had weathered his face, leaving lines around his eyes that made him look like he was in his late 20s. And those eyes were a striking gray blue, the color of a storm brewing over the mountains. They looked at her with a mix of hope and apology. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice sounding a whole lot stronger than she felt. "I am Adelaide Morrison." "Isaac Barrett," he said. He took one step closer, but kept a respectful distance. "I am the one who sent for a bride. The agency sent a letter saying you would be on the afternoon train." "You are late," Adelaide said, and she wished she could take back the sharpness in her voice the second the words were out. She was worn out, anxious, and battling the fear that had been her traveling companion all the way from Boston. Isaac's jaw got a little tight. "I do apologize. We had some trouble back at the ranch. One of the horses got herself tangled up in some wire fence, and by the time I got her loose, well, I got behind." He stopped for a moment like he was carefully choosing what to say next. "I would understand if you wanted to turn right around and head back east. I would not hold it against you for thinking I am not a reliable man." There was a pure honesty in his voice, a directness that caught Adelaide completely by surprise. She had braced herself for a lot of things, but true consideration was not one of them. Most men who sent for mail-order brides were after a housekeeper or a woman for their bed, not a real partner. The agency had warned her to keep her hopes low. "I do not have the money for a ticket back," Adelaide said softly, "and I have nothing to go back to, even if I did." Something shifted in Isaac's expression. Maybe it was understanding, or maybe he saw a little of himself in her. Then let me get your bag. I will show you the ranch. It is not much, but it is honest land, and I am doing my best to work it by myself." Adelaide handed him her satchel. He lifted it easily and led her toward a wagon that was hitched to two strong-looking horses. He helped her onto the bench seat with a gentle hand, his touch quick and proper. Then he climbed up next to her and took the reins. The wagon groaned as it started to move, rolling off from the little station and onto a dirt road that wound its way through the pines. They rode without a word for a few minutes. The only sounds were the clip-clop of the horses' hooves, the soft jingle of the harnesses, and that constant rush of the river in the distance. Adelaide took in the scenery, which was a world away from the brick and cobblestone streets of Boston. Everything out here felt so much bigger, so much wilder, like it did not care one bit about the neat and tidy lives of people. It was scary and, in a strange way, exciting all at once. "Why did you send for a bride?" Adelaide finally asked, the silence becoming too much to bear. Isaac kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "The ranch needs more than one pair of hands if it is going to make it. And I suppose I just got tired of my own cooking and talking to nothing but horses." He gave her a quick glance from the side of his eyes. "Why did you agree to come all the way west to marry a man you have never met?" Adelaide thought about making up a story, something romantic about wanting adventure or following destiny. But the honesty he had shown her deserved the same in return. "My parents died from typhoid fever this past winter. I do not have any brothers or sisters, and the house was sold to pay off their debts. I found work as a seamstress for 6 months, but the pay was hardly enough for a spot in a boarding house room with 5 other women. The marriage bureau felt like the only way forward that did not end with me having nothing at all, or worse." "I'm sorry to hear about your parents," Isaac said, and she could tell he truly meant it. "Thank you," Adelaide answered quietly. The ranch came into view after about another 20 minutes. It was simple, just like Isaac had said. A single-story house made of timber and stone, weathered but looking solid. A barn that had seen better days but still looked like it worked. A few corrals held about a dozen horses, and past that was open land for grazing that stretched out to the trees. In the distance, mountains rose up, their tops still showing patches of last winter's snow even in the late summer heat. Isaac helped Adelaide down from the wagon, and she just stood there for a moment, looking at the house that was supposed to be her home now. The whole thing felt like a dream, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. "The house has 2 bedrooms, Isaac said, his voice careful. "I have been using one. The other is yours until we can figure out how we want to move forward with this arrangement." He carried her bag right to the front door and just pushed it open. "Folks around here do not lock their doors much," he said, "though we probably ought to start, now that you are here." The inside of the house was cleaner than Adelaide had expected. The main room was the kitchen and living area all in one, with a wood stove, a scratched-up wooden table with 4 chairs and 2 armchairs that looked mighty comfortable sitting near a stone fireplace. Everything was tidy, if a little bare. Through one doorway she could see a bedroom with an iron bed frame, and Isaac led her through another door into what was clearly the spare room. It had a smaller bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the grazing pasture. "I know it is not fancy," Isaac said as he placed her bag on the bed, "but the roof keeps the rain out, and the stove will keep the place warm come winter." "It is more than enough," Adelaide said, running her hand over the top of the dresser. Not a speck of dust came off on her glove. "Thank you for getting it ready." Isaac gave a small nod, looking a bit relieved. "I will give you some time to get settled. There is water in the pitcher on the dresser if you would like to wash up. When you are ready, come on back to the main room and we can talk about what we both expect and all that." He left, pulling the door quietly shut behind him. Adelaide sat down on the bed, and suddenly the weight of what she had done washed over her. She had crossed an entire continent to marry a man she had laid eyes on for the very first time today. To live in a place so far from everything that the closest neighbor was likely miles down the road, to start a life from absolutely scratch. She gave herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the uncertainty and the fear. Then she stood up, unpacked the few things she owned into the dresser, washed her face and hands in the basin, and went to face whatever was coming next. Isaac was over by the stove pouring hot coffee into 2 tin cups. He handed one to her as she came in, and they sat down at the table facing each other. "I want to be plain with you about what I am looking for," Isaac started. "I need help with this ranch. The work is hard, and it is more than one man can handle on his own. I am hoping you are willing to learn the ranchin' life, though I do not expect you to know it all right now. In return, I can offer you a home, food, and what little protection I am able to give." He paused, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "The getting married part, the agency said we should be wed within a month of you getting here, but I am not about to force you into something you do not want. If you need time to decide if you can stand living out here or stand living with me, I will give you that time." Adelaide took a sip of her coffee. It was strong and bitter, and it was somehow just what she needed. "That sounds fair. I appreciate that." She looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not going to pretend I know the first thing about ranching, but I am not scared of hard work. I can cook, clean, and sew, and I learn things quickly. As for the marriage, I came here fully intending to honor the agreement. But I agree with you. We should at least get to know one another a bit before we stand in front of a preacher." "Then we have an understanding," Isaac said, and you could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. "For now, we will work as partners. We will just see how things go. No pressure, without rushing." The rest of that afternoon was like a slow, careful dance as they got used to being around each other. Isaac walked Adelaide over the land, telling her his ideas about growing the herd, getting the old barn in shape, and maybe putting in some crops if he could ever find the time. Adelaide paid close attention, asking smart questions, and started to see Isaac Barrett was a man with big dreams, but with both feet planted firmly on the ground. His hopes were measured by the hard truth of making a living. That evening, Adelaide cooked supper with what little food Isaac had. They had salt pork, beans, and biscuits. It was plain fare, but she had a knack for it, and Isaac ate like a man who truly meant it. "This is the finest meal I have had in months," he told her, sopping up the last of the bean juice with his biscuit. "Well then, your standards must be awfully low," Adelaide said back, but she had a little smile on her face. Over the next few days, they settled into a good rhythm. Isaac was up before the sun to see to the horses, and Adelaide got up soon after to get breakfast going. They would eat together, then get to work for the morning. Isaac showed Adelaide how to check the horses for hurts, how to clean out the stalls the right way, and how to patch up tack and fix loose fence posts. The work was bone-tiring, and she felt aches in muscles she never knew she had, but there was a deep satisfaction in it. At the close of each day, she could look back and see the real work she had done. Adelaide, for her part, brought a sense of order to the house. She straightened up the kitchen, washed and mended Isaac's worn-out clothes, and cooked good, hearty meals. She discovered a vegetable patch behind the house that had gone to weeds, and she used her spare moments to bring it back to life, coaxing some late-season squash and root vegetables out of that tired ground. They talked over their meals, sharing little bits of their pasts. Isaac told her he grew up on a small farm down in Missouri, the last of 4 boys. His folks had passed during the war, and his brothers had all gone their separate ways. He came out west 5 years ago, working all sorts of jobs until he scraped enough together to buy this piece of land. He built the house with his own 2 hands, with some help from neighbors who later left for greener pastures. Adelaide told him about Boston, about her father who was a clerk, and her mother who did sewing to help pay the bills. She told him about the fever that swept through their part of town, how she cared for both her parents until they were gone, and how the landlord gave her just 1 week to leave after they passed. She did not cry when she told him these things, but her voice got real quiet, and Isaac just listened without saying a word. 2 weeks after Adelaide got there, they rode into Downeyville together to get supplies. The town was bigger than Adelaide first reckoned, with a main street full of shops, saloons, and a hotel. Isaac hitched the wagon in front of the general store, and they went on inside. A middle-aged woman at the counter greeted Isaac like an old friend. "Well, Isaac Barrett, as I live and breathe," the woman said, "And who is this you have with you?" "This is Mrs. Fletcher." "And this here is Adelaide Morrison," Isaac said. "She came in on the train a couple of weeks back." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes got big like she understood everything at once. "The mail-order bride. I heard word was you had sent for one. Well, welcome to Downeyville, dear. I surely hope Isaac is treating you proper." "He has been very kind," Adelaide said, feeling a bit uncomfortable under the woman's gaze, but trying hard not to let it show. They bought flour, sugar, coffee, and other things they needed, and Mrs. Fletcher talked the whole time, sharing all the town gossip and asking Adelaide questions that were a little too personal. When they finally got out of the store and had the wagon loaded up, Adelaide felt worn out from having to be so sociable. "I do apologize for Mrs. Fletcher," Isaac said as they started back. "She means well, but she can be a handful." "She is just curious," Adelaide said. "I reckon a mail-order bride is big news around here. Probably the most excitement this town has seen since the mine caved in last spring," Isaac agreed. He took a quick look at her. "Does it bother you? All the attention?" Adelaide thought on it for a moment. "Not exactly, but it makes this all feel very real. Before it was just you and me and the ranch. Now other folks know, and they have ideas about who we are and what we are supposed to be. We do not have to live up to their ideas," Isaac said, and his voice was firm. "We just have to figure out what is right for us." That conversation stuck with Adelaide over the next few days. What was right for them? She started watching Isaac a little closer, noticing the little things he did. The way he always made sure she had enough water to drink before he took any for himself. How he would patiently show her again when she made a mistake with the horses, never making her feel small. The rare smile that would change his serious face and make him look warm and almost like a boy again. The respectful way he kept his distance, never getting too close, never assuming anything. He was, she realized, a good man. In a time and place where goodness could be hard to come by, Isaac Barrett worked hard, was true to his word, and treated her with respect. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for when she stepped on that train in Boston. One evening in early October, after they had cleaned up from supper and were sitting by the fire, Adelaide spoke up. "I think we should pick a day for the wedding." Isaac looked up from a piece of leather he was fixing, and his face showed pure surprise. "Are you certain about this?" "I am," Adelaide said. She folded her hands in her lap and chose her words with care. "I know this is not how things are normally done, and I know we have only known each other for a month, but I feel like we get along well enough. We work good together, and I think we can make a fine life here. Unless you have had second thoughts about wanting a wife." "I have not changed my mind," Isaac said right away. "I just want to be sure you are not feeling forced into anything. I meant what I said about giving you time." "I have had my time," Adelaide replied, "and I have made my choice. If you are still willing, I would like to marry you." A bright and strong look flashed in Isaac's eyes. "Then yes. Yes, Adelaide, I am more than willing." They got married 3 weeks later in the little church in Downeyville, with Mrs. Fletcher and her husband standing up for them as witnesses. Adelaide wore a simple dress she had made herself from cloth Isaac had bought for her in town. Isaac wore his best clean shirt and pants, with his hair combed back neat. The service was short. The preacher's words were familiar and worn like a smooth stone. But when Isaac took Adelaide's hand to put the thin gold ring on her finger, his touch was gentle, and his voice was strong. "I promise to care for you and work beside you for as long as we both shall live," he said, using his own words instead of the old ones. "And I promise the same to you," Adelaide answered, looking right into his eyes. When the preacher declared them married and told Isaac he could kiss his bride, there was a small moment where neither moved. Then Isaac leaned in and put his lips on hers, a kiss that was soft and quick and full of promise. Adelaide felt a little flutter in her chest, a warmth that was not from the stuffy church air. They had a small get-together at the hotel. Mrs. Fletcher had insisted on putting it all together, even though Adelaide said she did not have to. A dozen people from town came. Neighbors Adelaide had not met yet, offering congratulations and advice, and guessing how soon little Barretts would be running around the ranch. Adelaide smiled through it all with Isaac's hand resting steady on her lower back, like an anchor in a storm of chatter. When they finally got back to the ranch that evening, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, painting the whole sky in shades of orange and purple. Isaac helped Adelaide down from the wagon, and they stood there for a minute in the dimming light, neither one sure what to do next. "I am so glad I sent that letter to the marriage bureau," Isaac said in a low voice, "and I am thankful you were the one to answer it." "I am glad I came," Adelaide said, and she knew she meant it. "I was so scared on that train. I thought I was making the biggest mistake of my life, but being here with you, it feels right." Isaac reached up and tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear, and his fingers stayed on her cheek for a moment. "I want you to be happy here, Adelaide. I will do everything in my power to make sure you are. I know you will," she said. She stood on her toes and kissed him, with more confidence this time than she had in the church. Isaac answered the kiss, and his arms wrapped around her, pulling her in close. The kiss grew deeper, and Adelaide felt a warmth spread all through her, a mix of excitement and nerves. They went into the house, and Isaac built up the fire while Adelaide lit the lamps. They moved around each other with a new kind of feeling. The very air between them felt alive with what was to come. When Isaac finally took her hand and led her to his bedroom, which was now their bedroom, Adelaide went with him, her heart pounding in her chest but her mind perfectly clear. That night they came to each other with a gentle kindness and care. Isaac's touch was full of respect, and Adelaide's response was open and true. It was not the fiery passion of two people who knew each other well, but the honest, fumbling connection of two souls learning one another for the very first time. When it was over, Adelaide laid in Isaac's arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Are you all right?" Isaac asked in a soft whisper, his hand stroking her hair. "Yes," Adelaide said. "I am more than all right. I am happy." She felt Isaac's chest rise and fall beneath her, with a deep breath. "So am I." The winter that followed was a tough one, the way they can get out in the hill country. A blue norther blew in, and the cold settled deep in the bones of the land. Snow was rare, but ice was not, and it coated the bare branches of the oak trees. Isaac and Adelaide worked side by side to keep the livestock fed and warm, to keep the fire in the wood stove roaring, and to make sure their own pantry would last until the spring thaw. The quiet out there was something fierce. Some days all they saw was the wide gray sky and each other. But Adelaide found she didn't mind one bit. The little ranch house, which had felt so empty when she first set foot in it, now felt like a cozy shelter from the harsh world outside. She filled her days with cooking, mending clothes, reading the few books Isaac owned, and learning to play the old beat-up guitar he'd had since he was a boy. Isaac taught her to play poker in the evenings, and they'd bet with pecans and promises of future favors, laughing over silly bluffs. They talked for hours about the folks they were, where they came from, their dreams, and the things that scared them. Isaac told her he had worried no woman would ever have him, that he was too rough around the edges, not fancy enough. Adelaide admitted she had been scared to death that Isaac might be a cruel or mean-spirited man, that she had spent the whole train ride thinking up the worst things that could happen. "Well, I'm mighty glad we were both wrong," Isaac said, pulling her close on the worn-out sofa where they spent most of their evenings. "Me too," Adelaide whispered, kissing the side of his jaw. The connection between them grew stronger as they got more comfortable with one another. What had started as a shy and careful dance turned into something sure and deep. Adelaide learned that Isaac was a thoughtful partner, patient and kind, and she learned what made him happy in return. They found comfort in each other often during those long winter months, sometimes with a sense of urgency, sometimes slow and easy, but always with a tenderness that kept on growing. By January, Adelaide was sure she was expecting. Her monthly cycle had stopped, and she started feeling a bit sick to her stomach in the mornings. She waited another couple of weeks just to be certain before she told Isaac. feeling a little flutter of nerves about how he might take the news. She picked a night in February after they had cleaned up from supper. "Isaac, I have something to tell you." He looked up from a piece of wood he was carving, his eyes paying full attention. "What is it?" "I'm with child," Adelaide said, plain and simple. "I reckon I'm about 3 months along." Isaac froze right where he was. His carving knife stopped in midair. Then a smile spread clean across his face, a real, true smile just full of joy. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm sure," Adelaide confirmed, her own smile growing to match his. Isaac put down his knife and came over to her. He knelt down beside her chair and took both of her hands in his. "Adelaide, that's the best news I ever heard. Are you happy about it?" "I am," she said, and a wave of relief washed over her when she saw how happy he was. "I was nervous to tell you, but yes, I'm very happy." "Nervous? Now why in the world would you be nervous?" Isaac asked, looking truly confused. "I wasn't sure if you wanted children this soon," Adelaide admitted. "We've only been married 6 months." "Adelaide, I couldn't imagine better news," Isaac said, his voice full of feeling. He pressed his forehead down to their joined hands. "A baby. Our baby. Lord, I am so happy I could just about holler." "Please don't," Adelaide laughed. "You'll spook the horses." Isaac looked up and his eyes were shining bright. "I'm going to be a father, and you're going to be a mother. We're going to be a family." That night they lay in bed and talked about what was to come. Would the baby be a boy or a girl? What names did they like? How would they set up the house for when the baby came? Should they build another room onto the house? They talked late into the night, both of them too full of excitement to even think about sleep. The pregnancy went along just fine. Adelaide had to deal with morning sickness for the first few months, but it eased up by April. Her body began to change, her belly swelling as the baby grew inside her. Isaac was watchful and protective, always telling her not to work too hard. Though Adelaide refused to sit around and do nothing, she still did the cooking, still tended to her garden as it came back to life in the spring, and still helped with the chores that weren't too strenuous. Isaac, for his part, got busy getting everything ready. He built a cradle out of good pine wood, sanding it down until it was smooth as glass and carving little wildflowers into the headboard. He added on to the house, building a small nursery that connected right to their bedroom. He bought bolts of soft fabric in town, and Adelaide sewed tiny little outfits, amazed at how small the garments were. In June, about a month before Adelaide was due, they had some visitors show up out of the blue. A wagon rolled up the path carrying a man about Isaac's age, a woman a little younger, and 3 children who looked to be between 5 and 10 years old. "Isaac Miller," the man called out as Isaac and Adelaide came out of the house. "You probably don't remember me, but we worked a cattle drive together 6 years back. Name's Thomas Whitmore. I heard you had a place out this way and thought I'd stop in on our way through." Isaac's face lit up as he remembered. "Thomas, of course I remember you. It's good to see you again." He shook Thomas's hand and then said hello to his wife Helen and their kids. "We're heading north to Oregon," Thomas explained. "Looking for a fresh start, but we wanted to stop and say howdy." "Well, y'all have to stay for supper," Adelaide insisted. "Please, we hardly ever get company." Whitmores agreed, and the 2 families spent a nice evening together. The children ran all over the ranch, just happy to be out of the wagon. While the grown-ups talked, Thomas and Helen told them stories about their long journey and the hard parts of moving a whole family across the country. Adelaide and Isaac talked about the ranch, the baby on the way, and all their plans for the future. "You two seem to fit together real well," Helen remarked as she watched Isaac and Adelaide. "It's a nice thing to see. So many marriages out here are just about surviving." "I suppose ours started out that way," Adelaide admitted. "I came out here as a mail-order bride, the last one available that season, but it's turned into a whole lot more than that." "You love him," Helen said, plain and simple. Adelaide looked over at Isaac, who was showing Thomas the new nursery, waving his hands around as he explained how he built it. "Yes," she said, softly. "I do." I surely didn't expect to, but I do. Does he know? Helen asked. Adelaide blinked. She realized she had never actually said those words out loud to him. I'm not sure. We haven't ever really talked about it like that. You should tell him, Helen advised. Men can be blind as bats to things that seem plain as day to us. Words matter even when the feelings are already there. That night, long after the Whitmores had hitched up their wagon and moved on, Adelaide lay in bed thinking about what Helen had said. Did Isaac love her? She was sure he cared for her a great deal. You could see it in everything he did. But love, that was a bigger, deeper thing altogether. You're thinking mighty loud over there, Isaac murmured beside her, his hand resting gently on her round belly. What's on your mind? Adelaide turned to face him in the dim light. Helen said something today that made me realize I've never told you something important. What's that? Isaac asked, his voice curious, not worried. I love you, Isaac, Adelaide said simply. I didn't come here loving you, of course, but somewhere on this ranch I fell in love and I wanted you to know it. She felt Isaac go completely still next to her. Then he cupped her face with his hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. Adelaide, I think I've loved you since about the third day you were here. You were out in the garden, down on your knees in the dirt, and you looked up at me with a smudge on your nose and told me you were going to have fresh carrots by winter if it was the last thing you did. And I thought, now that's a woman worth loving. That is a woman I could spend my whole life with and be happy. Why didn't you ever say anything? Adelaide asked, her voice thick with emotion. I didn't want to push you, Isaac said. I figured you had enough to get used to without me getting all mushy before you were ready to hear it. But Adelaide, I love you. I love you so much it scares me sometimes how much I do. Adelaide kissed him then, a deep and heartfelt kiss, trying to put every bit of what she felt into it. They made love that night slowly and carefully, because of the baby. And afterward they lay tangled up together, whispering sweet nothings and promises into the dark. 3 weeks later, on a scorching hot July afternoon, Adelaide went into labor. Isaac rode his horse hard into Downieville to go fetch the midwife. Mrs. Patterson was a seasoned woman who had delivered just about every baby in the county for the last 20 years. She showed up with her bag of supplies and took charge of everything with a calm and steady hand. The labor was long, and it was hard. Adelaide knew giving birth would be painful, but the real thing was tougher than anything she had ever imagined. She squeezed Isaac's hand through the pains, sometimes crying out, sometimes biting her lip to keep from screaming. Isaac never left her side through the whole ordeal. He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, whispered words of encouragement, and let her squeeze his hand until his knuckles turned white. You're doing wonderful, dear, Mrs. Patterson said during a short break in the pain. The baby is coming along just like it's supposed to. A few more good pushes, and you will get to meet your little one. I can't, Adelaide gasped, feeling completely worn out. Yes, you can, Isaac said firmly, his face right next to hers. Adelaide, you are the strongest person I know. You can do this. She looked right into his eyes and found the strength she needed to keep going. With the very next contraction, she pushed with every last bit of strength she had. And then all of a sudden, the pressure was gone, and the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. It's a boy, Mrs. Patterson announced, holding up the squalling, brand-new infant. You've got a fine, healthy boy. Adelaide felt herself sink back into the pillows as tears of relief streamed down her cheeks. She noticed that Isaac was crying too, his gaze locked on the newborn as Mrs. Patterson gently cleaned and swaddled him. When the midwife finally laid the little one in her arms, Adelaide looked down at her son and felt a love so big it filled every corner of her heart. He was so tiny and red with a full head of dark hair. When his eyes fluttered open for a moment, they were the same grayish blue as his father's. His little fists waved in the air, and Adelaide caught one with her finger, amazed by his perfect miniature fingernails. He's beautiful, Isaac said, his voice raspy with emotion. He sat on the bed's edge and touched the baby's head with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "He is perfect," Adelaide whispered in agreement. They named him Jacob Samuel Barrett. Jacob was for Adelaide's father and Samuel was for Isaac's. All in all, he was a good baby, though his need for feeding kept them awake at all hours of the night. Adelaide was bone-tired, but this was a different kind of tired than she had ever known. It was a weariness filled with purpose and a deep, quiet joy. Isaac took to fatherhood right from the start. He changed diapers without a word of complaint and walked the floor with Jacob when the baby got fussy. He talked to him all the time, even though the little one could not understand a word. Adelaide would watch the two of them together and find herself falling in love with her husband all over again, seeing this whole new side of him. The months that followed were a real challenge. Running a ranch while caring for a newborn was no small task, but they made it work, just like they always had, as a team. Adelaide learned how to do her chores with Jacob snug in a sling she had sewn and strapped to her back. Isaac changed his own work schedule so he could be there when Adelaide needed to rest. Jacob grew fast, the way healthy babies do. By 6 months, he was sitting up on his own. By 9 months, he was crawling all over the place with a fierce determination. The house, which had once felt so quiet, was now filled with the sweet sounds of a baby's laughter and happy gurgles. They had to put up gates to keep Jacob from wandering into places he should not be. Isaac even built him a small playpen so he could be kept safe while they worked nearby. When Jacob turned 1 year old, they had a small party and invited the few neighbors who lived close enough to make the trip. Mrs. Fletcher and her husband came, along with the preacher and his wife, and 3 other families who farmed the nearby lands. It was a simple get-together, but Jacob loved all the attention, proudly showing everyone how he could stand up by holding on to the furniture. "You have done well for yourself," Mrs. Fletcher said to Adelaide. They were watching Isaac toss a giggling Jacob into the air. "The ranch is doing good. You have a handsome, healthy son, and it is plain to see you and Isaac are happy. That is more than most folks ever find." "I know," Adelaide said quietly. "Sometimes I think back to the day I got off that train, how scared and unsure I was. I never could have dreamed of having all this." "Well, life has a way of surprising you," Mrs. Fletcher replied. "Usually for the better, if you're brave enough to take the chances it gives you." That night, long after their guests had gone home and Jacob was sound asleep in his cradle, Adelaide and Isaac sat together on the porch, watching the stars pop out in the dark sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Adelaide asked. "Sending for a bride through the mail instead of finding a local girl?" Isaac pulled her in closer to his side. "Never," he said. "Not for a single second. You are everything I ever could have wished for, and 1,000 things I never knew I needed." He paused for a moment before adding, "Do you have any regrets about coming?" "No," Adelaide said without hesitation. "It was the best choice I ever made. Coming out here, marrying you, and building this life with you. I love all of it. I love you." "I love you too," Isaac said, and he gently kissed the top of her head. "More than I could ever find the words to say." They sat there in a comfortable silence, just listening to the sounds of the ranch at night. An owl hooted from the trees. The horses shifted around in the barn. They could hear the river flowing in the distance. Everything felt peaceful. Everything felt right. In the years that followed, the ranch kept on growing. Isaac bought more horses, built new barns, and earned a name for himself as an honest man to do business with. Adelaide made the garden bigger and learned how to can and preserve their food, making sure they always had more than enough put away for the long, hard winters. Jacob grew from a curious toddler into a talkative little boy who followed his father everywhere he went, asking questions from sunup to sundown. When Jacob was 3 years old, Adelaide found out she was pregnant again. Everyone was overjoyed with the news. Jacob was excited about having a brother or sister, even if he did not quite understand what that meant. Isaac was thrilled and just prayed for another healthy child. This pregnancy was easier than her first one. Adelaide knew what to expect this time, and her body seemed to handle it better. She kept up with her work for most of the 9 months, only slowing down in the last few weeks. When her labor started in March, Isaac went to fetch Mrs. Patterson once more. The good midwife delivered a healthy baby girl after a labor that was thankfully much shorter than Jacob's had been. They named her Ruth Elizabeth Barrett, and she was her daddy's girl from the very beginning. She had Adelaide's dark hair, but she also had Isaac's gray-blue eyes. Even as a tiny baby, she had a serious, watchful look on her face that made her seem much older than she was. Jacob was absolutely taken with his new baby sister. He always wanted to hold her, though they had to watch him closely to make sure he was gentle enough. "My baby," he would tell anyone who came to visit. "My Ruth." "Not just yours," Adelaide would gently correct him with a smile. "She belongs to all of us." But Jacob was not far from the truth. As Ruth grew, she and Jacob became as close as could be. He was always looking out for her, keeping her entertained when she was fussy, and teaching her things as soon as she was old enough to understand. For her part, Ruth simply adored her big brother. Her whole face would light up with a smile the moment he walked into a room. Adelaide would watch her two children playing together and feel a deep sense of peace. Back in Boston, when she was all alone and had nearly given up hope, this life was something she never even allowed herself to dream about. A real family, a proper home, and a husband who loved her down to his bones. It still took her by surprise some days, how far she had come. The first true test of their little family came when Ruth was 2 years old and Jacob was 5. A wicked blue norther came howling across the plains that January, kicking up a blizzard that raged for 3 whole days. The snow piled up in great big drifts against the house and the barn, and the cold was so fierce it froze the water in the horse troughs solid as a rock. Every few hours, Isaac would bundle up and head out to check on the stock, making sure they had feed and were as protected as could be. On the second day, he staggered back inside, barely making it to the door, his face all tight and white with pain. "What on earth happened?" Adelaide asked, rushing to help him. "My boots went right out from under me on a patch of ice by the barn," Isaac said, his teeth clenched hard. "Twisted my ankle good, might have snapped it." "I am not rightly sure." Adelaide helped him to a chair and took a look at the ankle. It was already puffing up something awful. She wrapped it up tight with cloth, propped it up on a stool, and made him swear he would stay put. But the livestock still had to be tended to, and there was not another soul around to do it. "I will go," Adelaide declared, her voice firm. "Adelaide, you will not," Isaac shot back. "It is just too dangerous out there. You can hardly see your hand in front of your face, and if you get turned around, you could freeze solid before you ever found the house again." "Well, what do you reckon we do then?" Adelaide asked, standing her ground. "The horses cannot last without food and water until this storm decides to let up. They will surely die." Isaac's jaw muscle worked back and forth as he wrestled with the terrible choice. At last he said, "We will go together. You can help me get out there, and I will talk you through everything that needs doing. We will tie a rope to the back porch and string it all the way to the barn door. That way we cannot get lost." It was a long way from a perfect plan, but it was the only one they had. Adelaide bundled up in every layer of clothing she owned, made sure the children were safe and busy inside, and then helped Isaac hobble out into the howling storm. The wind was so fierce it nearly blew her off her feet, and the stinging snow felt like tiny needles on her face. Isaac had been right about not being able to see. She could hardly make out her own hands in front of her, but they followed the rope Isaac had tied and made it to the barn. Once they were inside and out of the wind, Adelaide got right to work. Isaac sat on a bale of hay and told her exactly what to do. Feed the horses, break up the ice in their water troughs, and then refill them. Check on every single animal to see if they were in trouble. It was back-breaking work, made even harder by the bitter cold and her own fear, but Adelaide just kept going. They made 3 of those trips during the storm, each one a difficult and dangerous journey, but they managed to keep all the horses alive and neither of them got seriously hurt. When the storm finally passed on the 4th day, It left behind a world covered in white drifts and sparkling ice. Adelaide was completely worn out, but she was also incredibly proud. "I never could have done that without you," Isaac said as they stood together looking out at the clear blue sky. His ankle was still swollen, but he was able to put a little weight on it now. "You saved the horses, Adelaide. You saved this ranch." "We saved it together," Adelaide corrected him, "just like we do everything." Isaac pulled her in for a hug and kissed her cold lips. "Partners," he said. "Always," Adelaide agreed. The years kept passing by, following the steady rhythm of life on the ranch. Jacob started going to school in town. He would ride in with Isaac on supply runs, then stay with Mrs. Fletcher through the week and come back home on the weekends. He learned how to read and write and do sums, too, and read poetry. Ruth arrived 3 years down the road, and she turned out to be even more of a bookworm than her brother. A mix of pride and a little sadness washed over Adelaide as she watched her children grow. They were becoming their own people, strong and independent. Jacob had his daddy's love for horses and a real knack for training them. Ruth, on the other hand, was curious about everything, always asking about science, history, and the big world outside their little piece of California. Adelaide kept working the ranch right alongside Isaac, and their bond grew stronger with each season that passed. They understood each other's ways so well by now that they could work side by side without a single word, knowing what the other needed and filling in the gaps as if it were second nature. In the evenings, they still sat and talked, but now their conversations were often about the children's futures, wondering if Jacob might want to run the ranch one day, or if Ruth would want to get more schooling. "I swear sometimes I cannot believe how lucky I am," Isaac said one evening when the children were sound asleep, and it was just the two of them by the fire. "That day you got off the train, the very last mail-order bride they had. I had no idea I was meeting the person who would become my whole world." Adelaide rested her head on his shoulder. "I felt so passed over that day, like I was the last one left that nobody else had picked. Now I understand it just meant I was being saved for the person I was meant to be with." "You were always the only one for me," Isaac said in a low voice. "Even before I knew your name, you were the one I was waiting for." They shared a long, deep kiss, still able to spark that old flame in each other after all this time. That night they made love with the easy comfort that comes from years together, each one knowing just what pleased the other, their bodies fitting together as seamlessly as their lives did. When Adelaide was 35 and Isaac was 38, they found out they were going to be parents one more time. The pregnancy was a surprise, but a happy one. Jacob was 12 now, and Ruth was 9, both of them old enough to be thrilled about a new baby in the house. Everything went along just fine with the pregnancy, although Adelaide felt it was more tiring than the first two. Her body was older now, not quite as quick to bounce back. That October, Adelaide's labor started. Mrs. Patterson came over just like she had twice before, but this time, things got complicated. The baby was not in the right position, and the labor just seemed to drag on for almost 20 hours. Adelaide was exhausted, just completely worn out and barely awake, when Mrs. Patterson finally managed to get the baby turned around. "Just one more push, Adelaide," the midwife encouraged her. "Give it every last bit of strength you have." Adelaide looked over at Isaac, who was pale with worry, but doing his best to stay strong for her. She dug down deep for a strength she did not know she had, and pushed with all her might. The baby finally came free, and Mrs. Patterson worked fast to clear his little airway. For one awful moment, the room was completely silent. Then, a small, weak cry echoed through the house, and Adelaide began to cry with pure relief. "It is another boy," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice tired but pleased. "He is small, but he is healthy. You did a good job, Adelaide." They decided to name him Samuel Isaac Barrett, flipping the names they had given to Jacob. Samuel was a little fella, smaller than his brother or sister had been, but he was a fighter with a strong will to live. He ate eagerly, put on weight just fine, and had a set of lungs that could wake up the whole house. Jacob and Ruth were just taken with their new baby brother. They helped take care of him. argued over whose turn it was to hold him, and tried everything to be the first to make him smile. Adelaide would watch her 3 children all together and feel like her heart could just burst with happiness. As the children grew bigger, the ranch expanded right along with them. Isaac put up a bigger barn, bought more land for grazing, and built a good name for himself that had buyers coming all the way from San Francisco. Adelaide's garden did so well that she started selling her extra vegetables and canned goods in town, which gave her a little income of her own that she put away carefully. The years also brought some sorrow. Mrs. Fletcher passed on when Samuel was 3, and Adelaide wept at her funeral, thinking of how sweet the old woman had been to her when she first got to Downeyville. All alone and scared, the preacher who married them retired and went to live with his daughter. Mrs. Patterson passed away in her sleep at 72, and the entire town grieved for the woman who had helped bring so many of them into the world. But there was plenty of joy, too. Jacob grew up to be a tall, strong young man who could manage any horse on the ranch, even a few that other folks had given up on. At 19, he married a local girl, Catherine Sanders, who moved onto the ranch and helped out with all the work. Adelaide gave her new daughter-in-law a warm welcome, remembering what it felt like to be the new stranger joining a family. Ruth followed her dream of getting an education and ended up becoming a teacher right there in Downeyville. She met and married a doctor who had just set up his practice in town, and they built a nice house near the school. She came out to the ranch often, bringing her husband for Sunday dinners and helping Adelaide with the canning every autumn. Samuel, their little surprise, grew into a quiet, artistic boy who preferred drawing and music over working the ranch. At first, Isaac worried that this meant Samuel would not want to stay on the land. But Adelaide promised him they would support their youngest son no matter what road he chose. "We were fortunate enough to live the life we wanted," she said to Isaac. "We ought to give our children that same chance." "You are right," Isaac had to agree. "I just pray that whatever he picks makes him happy." When Adelaide turned 45, she and Isaac celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children threw a big party for them at the ranch and invited folks from all over. It was a perfect day in September, warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the smell of pine down from the forest. Adelaide stood beside Isaac as their neighbors and friends made toasts to their long marriage, their thriving ranch, and their wonderful children. She looked at the life they had built from scratch and found it hard to believe she was the same scared young woman who had stepped off that train 2 decades before. "What is on your mind?" Isaac asked her quietly, with his arm wrapped around her waist. "I am thinking about that telegram I got right before I left Boston," Adelaide said. "It told me I was the last mail-order bride available for the season. I thought it meant I was just a leftover, the last choice. But now I know it really meant I was being saved for you." Isaac's eyes looked a little misty. "You were never a leftover, Adelaide. From the second I laid eyes on you on that platform, you were everything. And every single day since has just proven that you were the exact wife, the partner, and the person I needed." "And you were exactly what I needed too," Adelaide answered. "Even when I did not know what I was hoping for, you were more than I could have dreamed. You gave me a home, a family, and a love I never thought was possible." They kissed right then and there in front of everyone, and all their guests cheered and clapped. Their children groaned a little, embarrassed but also happy, and Adelaide could see the joy in their faces, the kind of security that comes from being raised in a house truly filled with love. The years kept marching on. Jacob and Catherine had children of their own, a set of twin girls that Adelaide just adored spoiling. Ruth and her husband had a son, a serious little boy who was just like his mother. Samuel did end up leaving the ranch, moving to San Francisco to study art. But he came back to visit a lot and always called the ranch his home. Isaac's dark brown hair turned to silver, and Adelaide started finding streaks of gray in her own hair. They moved a little slower than they used to, their bodies showing the signs of a long life of hard work. But they were healthy, content, and still very much in love. For their 30th anniversary, they took a special trip just for themselves, leaving the ranch in Jacob's good hands to go visit Samuel in San Francisco. The city was a bit much after so many years out in the country, but it was also exciting. Samuel showed them his art studio, his paintings that were selling, and the new life he had made for himself. Adelaide was so proud of her youngest son and thankful he had found his own way. "Do you ever regret staying on the ranch?" Samuel asked her one evening while they were taking a walk through Golden Gate Park. "You could have lived a different life, maybe an easier one." Adelaide thought about his question for a moment. "No, I do not regret it. The ranch was definitely hard work. But it has also brought me a deep sense of satisfaction, and I have had your father right there with me through it all. That is what made all the difference." "He loves you so much," Samuel said. "You can see it in every single thing he does." "And I love him," Adelaide said, "plain and simple. Even more now than when we were first married, and I did not think that was even possible back then." Love grows, Samuel. It gets deeper and it changes and turns into something richer over time. They came back to the ranch after a week in the city, and Adelaide was surprised at just how good it felt to be home. The house she once thought was so plain now looked beautiful to her, filled to the brim with memories and meaning. The land that once seemed so scary now felt like an old, trusted friend, familiar and comforting. Isaac and Adelaide eased into their later years with a quiet grace. They slowly handed over more of the ranch work, operations to Jacob, though they still helped with daily chores. They poured their time into their grandkids, teaching them all about the ranch, about living a good life, and about the importance of putting your back into your work and loving with your whole heart. One evening, when Adelaide was 52 years old, she and Isaac sat on the porch, a ritual they had performed more times than they could count. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, setting the whole sky on fire with color. Their grandkids were running wild in the yard, their laughter drifting on the cool evening air. "Do you remember what you told me that first day I got here?" Adelaide asked. "About how this ranch was not much, but it was honest land." "I remember," Isaac said. "I was worried you would be let down, that you were expecting a place a whole lot grander." "I was scared to death that day," Adelaide confessed. "But you were so honest, so plain-spoken. You did not spin any tall tales or try to show off with things you did not rightly own. You just offered me yourself and this life, exactly as it was." "It was the only thing I had to give," Isaac said. "It was everything," Adelaide corrected him. "You were everything. You still are." Isaac reached for her hand, his thumb gently rubbing the back of it. "When I wrote that letter to the marriage agency, I was half desperate and half hoping for a miracle. I never in my wildest dreams thought they would send me a woman like you. A woman who would become more than just my wife, but my partner, my best friend, the very center of my world." "I was the last bride they had," Adelaide said softly. "But I was the right one for you and for this life. It all turned out just the way it was supposed to." They settled into a comfortable quiet as the sun finished its journey, and the first stars began to poke through the twilight. From inside the house, Catherine was starting on dinner, and the warm smell of it cooking wafted out to them. Jacob was out in the barn, finishing up the evening chores. The grandkids kept right on playing, fueled by that endless energy only children have. "I would do it all over again," Isaac said out of the blue. "Every last second, every hard time, every struggle, I would live it all the same, just to land right here with you." "Me too," Adelaide agreed. She rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in that familiar smell of him, a mix of leather and hay and home. "Me too." As the years rolled by, Adelaide and Isaac watched their family tree branch out and grow strong. More grandchildren came along, every single one a joy and a blessing. The ranch stayed prosperous, providing a good life for Jacob and his family. Ruth rose to become the head teacher at the schoolhouse, a woman respected by the whole community. Samuel's artwork started getting noticed, and he eventually found himself a wife who shared his love for painting. When Isaac hit his 60th birthday, Adelaide put on a party that brought together 4 whole generations of the Barrett family. Looking at the crowd of faces that were all there because she stepped off that train in Downeyville, Adelaide felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly took her breath away. That night, long after everyone else had gone home or turned in for the night, Isaac and Adelaide stood outside looking up at the blanket of stars. 33 years ago, you took a big gamble on a stranger, Isaac said. You came all the way out west to marry a man you had never laid eyes on, to live in a place you had never even seen. That took a whole lot of courage. I was just desperate, Adelaide said. I did not feel brave at all. But you were, Isaac insisted. And you have been brave every single day since then. Brave and strong and just plain wonderful. You are the one who turned this ranch into a home, Adelaide. You are what made my life worth living. Adelaide turned to him, taking his weathered face between her hands. And you gave me a reason to find that bravery. You showed me what real love could be, what being partners truly meant. Every good thing in my life started the day I got here, and you were standing on that platform waiting for me. They shared a kiss, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 3 decades of love and dedication, and a life built together. All around them, the ranch was quiet beneath the stars, a monument to what 2 people could create when they found each other. The years kept coming, each one weaving another thread into the rich story of their life together. There were tough times because life always brings them. A fire broke out in the barn one year, but thankfully they got it put out before it could spread. A long drought tested their grit and smarts. Isaac's health started to fade in his late 60s, his heart not the sturdy muscle it used to be. But they faced it all, side by side, just like they always had. Adelaide stayed strong deep into her 60s, her hands still steady, and her mind as sharp as ever. She took to caring for Isaac when he needed it, the same way he had cared for her through 3 babies and more sicknesses than she could recall. Their children and grandchildren gathered around them, a constant source of support and love. On a spring morning, when Adelaide was 68 and Isaac was 71, they woke up together in the bed they had shared for over 4 decades. Isaac's breathing was shallow, his face pale. Adelaide knew with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing a person inside and out, that this was the beginning of the end. She sent for their children, and they came running. Jacob from the barn where he was now the boss, Ruth from town with her husband, Samuel from San Francisco as he had been visiting for the week. They all gathered in the bedroom along with Catherine and a few of the older grandkids who were old enough to understand. Isaac looked at every one of them, his eyes still shining despite his tired body. I am proud of all of you, he said, his voice a quiet rasp but clear as a bell. You have all built good lives. You have all been a blessing to me. Then his gaze fell on Adelaide, and his whole face softened into something beautiful. Adelaide, my love, my bride, you were the last one left, but you were the only one I ever needed. You gave me everything, a home, a family, and a love that made every single day worth waking up for. Adelaide squeezed his hand, tears rolling down her cheeks. And you gave me the same, Isaac. You rescued me when I was lost. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. You showed me what it really means to share a life with someone. No regrets? Isaac asked softly. Not one, Adelaide answered, her voice firm. Every moment with you has been a gift. Isaac smiled, and it was the very same smile he had given her on that train platform so long ago, a smile full of hope and honesty. Good. That is good. He closed his eyes then, his hand still tight in Adelaide's. His breathing got lighter, and the quiet spaces between each breath grew longer. Adelaide just sat with him, stroking his hair, whispering her love to him. Their children stayed nearby, a silent circle of support. Just as the sun hit its peak in the sky, filling the room with golden light, Isaac took one last long breath and let it go with a slow sigh. And then he was gone. His face was at peace, his hand still warm inside of hers. The grief was a powerful thing, a deep ache that Adelaide felt in her bones. For the first time in 43 years, she was truly on her own. The man who had been her partner in all things, who had known her better than she knew herself, was gone. But even lost in her sorrow, Adelaide found a measure of peace. She had been blessed to know a love that most people only read about. She had shared a life that was overflowing with purpose and meaning. Isaac had been hers, and she had been his, and death itself could not steal away those years of happiness. The funeral was a big one. The church was filled to the brim with people whose lives Isaac had touched over the years, neighbors, folks he did business with, and friends from all over the county. They told stories about Isaac's fairness, his tireless work ethic, and his deep love for his family. Adelaide listened, and she cried, and she accepted all their sympathies, held up by her children and grandchildren. In the weeks that followed, Adelaide had to figure out how to be alone again. It was much harder this time than when she was a young woman back in Boston. Back then, her loneliness was mixed with grief and fear. Now, it was filled with memories and loss. But she was not completely alone. Her children came by often, making sure she had everything she needed. Her grandkids filled the old house with noise and life. The ranch kept on humming around her, a steady and comforting presence. Adelaide lived for another 15 years after Isaac passed on. She got to see more grandchildren born, and even a few great-grandchildren. She helped out on the ranch where she was able, even as her body got more frail with each passing year. She stayed in the house Isaac had built, sleeping in their bedroom, surrounded by the life they had made side by side. She would tell their story to anyone who would sit and listen. Stories about the Wild West as it was tamed, about mail-order brides and starting new, about finding love in the most unexpected of places. She wanted their story to be remembered. She wanted folks to know what was possible when two strangers decided to take a chance on one another. On a quiet morning in the early fall, when the leaves were just starting to show their colors, and the air carried the first crisp promise of winter, Adelaide Morrison Barrett died peacefully in her sleep. She was 83 years old, and she passed away in the house she had made a home, on the ranch she had helped grow, surrounded by the echoes of the love that had shaped her entire life. At her funeral, her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all came together to celebrate a life lived to the fullest. They spoke of her strength, her kindness, and the endless love she had for their father and grandfather. They told the story of how she came west, the very last mail-order bride available, and from that humble start, she built a legacy that would last for many lifetimes. Jacob, an old man himself by then, stood by her grave and said, "My mama taught us that love is not about big fancy gestures or living in a fairy tale. It is about showing up day after day and doing the work, working side by side, building a life that mattered with a person who saw you as their equal." She and my father, they showed everyone that two people who started as strangers could grow into each other's whole world if they just had the grit to try. Adelaide was laid to rest right next to Isaac, their graves marked on a little hill that looked out over the whole ranch. The words carved on her headstone were plain and true. Adelaide Morrison Barrett, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She headed west looking for a way to survive, and found a great love instead. The ranch stayed in the family for generations after, passed down through the children and grandchildren that Adelaide and Isaac had raised. The old house was kept up, with folks adding what was needed over the years, but always taking care to keep its spirit alive, and the story was always told. The story of how Isaac Barrett sent off for a mail-order bride, how Adelaide Morrison answered that call, and how the two of them have built something truly special from the humblest of beginnings. It turned out Adelaide had been right all along, standing on that dusty train platform. She was the last bride left that season. Not because nobody wanted her, but because she was being kept for the one man who was just right. Isaac needed her, exactly her, with all her strength and her nerve and her big heart full of love. And Lord knows she needed him, with his honesty and his gentle ways and his steady, unwavering heart. They were made for each other, like two halves of a whole that fit together perfectly, even though they came from completely different corners of the world. Their love was built on a foundation of respect and partnership. It got deeper with every hardship they faced together, and it was kept alive by a true fondness that just got stronger as the years went by. It was the kind of love story that could only have happened out here in the West, in that short little slice of time when men wrote letters to find a wife, and women got on trains to marry men they had never met. Their story started with need and desperation, but with a whole lot of courage and commitment, it turned into something beautiful that would last. And even though Isaac and Adelaide were long gone from this world, the love they shared lived on. It lived in the family they started, in the ranch they built from the ground up, and in the story that was told over and over again. They were living proof that sometimes the best things in life do not come from a fancy plan or perfect timing. They come from taking a leap of faith into the unknown and working your fingers to the bone to make something better than what either of you could have made by yourselves. Adelaide had stepped down from that train, scared and all alone, the very last bride available that nobody else had claimed. But she was claimed by the only person who mattered. Isaac had looked at her and did not see a not leftover or a second choice. He saw a woman who had the potential to be his partner, his equal, and the love of his life. And together they built a life that was bigger and better than either one of them ever dared to pray for. In the end, that is all a person can really ask for, all anyone can hope to build. A life founded on love, held up by partnership, and remembered with a smile. They found all of that together, the cowboy and his mail-order bride, and their story would keep being told long after they both had returned to the dust. They had worked so hard and so faithfully for so many years. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.